mynews.studio.
At the United Nations this week, negotiators are debating whether a global wealth tax could actually fund climate action. The big question is, will new rules finally close those billion-dollar loopholes?
And today is February 7th, 2026. The UN has resumed talks in New York about creating a framework for international tax cooperation. These aren't just routine paperwork meetings. They're specifically targeting tax avoidance, both by fossil fuel companies and by the ultra-wealthy. Why is this coming up now?
The reason is pretty direct. Multinational corporations and high-net-worth individuals have been using loopholes to shift profits and avoid taxes, especially in developing countries. That means those countries lose out on money for climate adaptation, social services, and even basic infrastructure. This round of talks is actually building on a 2022 African proposal. For the first time, the UN General Assembly, not just the OECD, is steering the process. That's a real change in who gets to set the rules.
That's important because, if I'm remembering right, the OECD has been criticized for mostly representing the interests of wealthier countries. Now, with African leadership, especially coming out of Nairobi, there's a focus on human rights, climate finance, and the Sustainable Development Goals. But on the ground, what are negotiators actually arguing over?
The main split is between the African Union, which wants strong binding obligations, and the European Union, which is pushing back against anything that would force them to change their national laws or give up tax sovereignty. The African bloc is arguing for fair taxing rights, meaning taxes should be paid where economic activity really happens. They also want clear links between tax rules and sustainable development, so the revenue actually funds climate and social programs.
And the European Union?
The EU prefers general principles instead of binding commitments. They want flexibility, so they're opposed to mandatory treaty renegotiations or strict formulas that could lead to double taxation. Their focus is more on voluntary information exchange, especially about high net worth individuals. For them, it's really about protecting national sovereignty.
And where do the BRICS countries stand in all this? They seem to take a middle ground.
India and Brazil, for instance, are calling for progressive taxation on wealthy individuals and fossil fuel profits. But they also want frameworks that won't overburden developing economies. They're connecting tax reforms to goals like gender equality and climate, but they emphasize cooperation over rigid rules. The biggest points of contention are binding rules on taxing rights and how to handle taxes on high net worth individuals and fossil fuel profits. There's been some progress on voluntary audits, but when it comes to mandatory arbitration or enforcing climate and inequality goals, things get much more controversial. Even the language about sustainable development is still pretty vague.
If the new framework actually gets finalized by 2027, what would change in practice? Would it really boost funding for climate action or reduce poverty?
Some of the mechanisms being discussed include making sustainable development a core part of the agreement, so any tax cooperation has to balance economic, social, and environmental goals. There could be protocols that directly link tax treaties to the Sustainable Development Goals, climate finance, and human rights. Plus, a conference of the parties would monitor compliance, review the protocols, and make sure there's transparency in how tax revenues are used.
And what about support for countries that don't have the capacity to enforce these rules, or access to public information about how taxes are collected and spent?
Both are key pillars in the current proposals. There would be technical assistance for countries that need help enforcing tax rules. Public reporting and shared administrative assistance would make it harder to hide illicit money flows. Anti-avoidance rules are supposed to guarantee that the new funds actually go to social protection and climate resilience.
But if these talks break down or just stall, what options do developing countries have?
They still have options. Countries can renegotiate their own tax treaties, either one-on-one or in groups. They can also create domestic rules, like simplified nexus rules or exit taxes on the wealthy. Some might use OECD-style information exchanges or joint audits. There's also the possibility of regional agreements, like what the Africa Group is considering. And don't forget civil society. They can push for more transparency or fight against austerity that cuts social spending.
Why should people who aren't following UN negotiations closely care about any of this?
Because it's really about who ends up paying for the climate crisis and whether the global economic system can be made fairer. These negotiations could unlock huge amounts of money for climate and social programs. Or if they fall short, things could stay the same, with vulnerable nations left underfunded. The result will affect democracy, human rights, and the stability of countries already facing serious challenges.
So, the stakes here are genuinely high, and the divisions are deep. Whether this process leads to real change or just more debate is going to shape how the world responds to inequality and climate change for the next decade.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us as we break down what's at stake in these UN tax justice talks.
We'll keep following these negotiations and what they mean for people everywhere.
Thanks for listening. This episode was brought to you by mynews.studio. Try it now for free.